Just say it, man. Don't make me ask 20 questions.
What is the point?
Get to the point.
Just say it already.
Welcome to the Podcram. Got a long one for you today, and I'm not apologizing. This was one of my dream episodes. I couldn't wait for it to happen. Dr. Andrew Huberman interviews Dr. Jordan Peterson, and they go deep.
So I view the brain as obviously a bunch of cells and parts, etc., but I distill it down to some sort of basic features. First of all, we have an autonomic physiology. I think we'd both agree on that regulates our sleepiness and wakefulness, our breathing, our heart rate, stuff that runs in the background. And then we have a lot of circuitry devoted to what I would call impulses, things that we desire, we want to move toward, appetitive behaviors, and we also have some impulses to avoid things that are putrid, painful, etc. That's all in there like it is in other animals.
We should talk about the idea of impulse in relationship to that characterization.
Okay.
Yeah, because there's an important point to be made on the you pay a price for characterizing that as impulse, and I'd like to explore that with you because it's crucial.
Great. We'll circle back to impulse. I'd like to do that. And then we have a lot of circuitry. People will hear about it as executive function, prefrontal circuitry, which does many things, but I like to think of as a circuit that can say, and here I'm borrowing from a previous guest who's a neurosurgeon, it can say shh, or exert what's called top-down suppression on these, what I'm calling impulses. It can...
We should talk about that too, the suppression idea and the inhibition idea in general.
Great.
Because I think there's a parallel problem there to the notion of impulse that's very much worth delving into.
Great.
Yeah.
So circuitry that's devoted to our ability to self-inhibit the desire to reach for something or to avoid something. We can push ourselves into things that would otherwise be aversive. We can avoid doing things that would otherwise drive us to, quote unquote, just do it anyway. And then we have what I think of as our default settings, kind of how we're operating in the world with respect to food, other people, ourselves, our thoughts, if we don't intervene with ourselves. And these default settings are, of course, established by both nature, a genetic program that wires up circuitry, but also nurture because of the immense neuroplasticity that occurs in the first 25 years plus of life, but especially those first years of life. And then, of course, we have neuroplasticity, this incredible gift that humans have more of than any other species as far as we know, which is we can decide to make changes. Now, the reason I lay out this framework as opposed to starting with a question is because there are so many amazing questions that you ask in this book. You know, we who wrestle with God, I mean, trying to wrap our arms and minds around this huge set of questions. And it occurred to me to just step back from all of that and ask, is part of the reason that we have a concept of God, that there are multiple religions, is that the consequence of some humans at some point realizing, or perhaps God himself realizing, that what we are equipped with as humans, which we just described, is insufficient to allow us to evolve as a species and be the best version of ourselves. I think this, for me, really is like the central question of at least my life, which is, to what extent do I need to intervene with my default settings, rewire them, engage that prefrontal cortex and, push down on some appetitive or aversive behaviors? And to what extent can we do that? Maybe,
and to what end?
And to what end? And maybe we need a rule book. I am starting to believe, and I'm now 49 years old, that we need a rule book, that the neural circuitry that's encased within our skulls is not sufficient to allow us to navigate through life to our best outcome.
We kind of know that we need a rule book. Even you admitted that in some ways implicitly when you discussed the fact that we have a 25-year socialization window. And what that means is that we have to interact with other people and our traditions in order to set us right. And that's so complex it takes 25 years. And so we're learning something from that. And that's indication that our, let's say, default biological settings are insufficient to guide us into the future, right? And so then the question is, well, what is it that you're learning as a consequence of that socialization process? And you can think about it, and people have thought about it as a series of complex inhibitions of lower order motivational states, impulses. But I'm not very happy with the inhibition model because inhibition is unsophisticated socialization. Integration is sophisticated socialization. So here's a way of, I really learned this, I think, from contrasting Freud with Piaget. Because Freud's model, superego, is really an inhibition model, and Freud was a neurologist. Piaget's model was very different. He thought of the properly socialized person as someone who had integrated their lower order, we'll call them impulses for now, into a sustainable voluntary structure that regulated them and gave them all their proper place. That's very different than an inhibitory model. So, for example, I'll give you an example from my own life. My son was quite an willful young child.
Wonder
when
where
he was
he
2.
got it from.
Yeah, well, fair enough. And my father was, a formidable character. And so my son liked to do what he liked to do. And it took him quite a bit of tussling with him to help him, I wouldn't say inhibit that or regulate it, to integrate it. And one of the consequences of that was he became a very good athlete. And so why is that relevant? Well, because it wasn't like he stopped being assertive or even aggressive. It's that he learned how to put that aggression in its proper place in relationship to a goal that was much more sophisticated than merely getting his own way moment to moment. Okay, so integration's a better, like a very sophisticated athlete, a team athlete in particular, isn't not aggressive. And they're not inhibiting their aggression on the playing field. They may now and then when they're provoked, let's say, but all things considered, what they've done is subordinate their aggression to a higher order goal that enables them to be more successful, but also to be successful in a maximally social and sustainable way. And Piaget's point, and he's absolutely right about this, is that that's much better conceptualized as integration. And then with regard to impulse, because I said I would return to that, I spent a lot of time walking through the behavioral literature, right? And a lot of that was derived from animal experiments, and it was predicated on the idea that if you could explain something on the basis of a deterministic reflex, you should. And there's something to be said for that hypothesis. Don't make your theory any more complex than it needs to be. How far can you get with a theory of chained reflexes, a deterministic theory? The behaviorists got a long way. They couldn't get to the highest strata of human endeavor with a chained reflex theory, but there was a lot of things they did that were very good. But one of the things they made a big mistake about was to conceptualize motivational states, let's say, as impulses or drives. That's not sufficient because it fails to take into account the effect of those states on perception. So it's much better to think of a motivated state. This is what helped me integrate behavioral theory with psychoanalytic theory, especially the psychoanalytic theory of religious endeavor. It's much better to think of those lower order motivational states as personalities. They're sub-personalities. They have their perceptions. They have their objects of perception. They have their cognitive rationalizations. You certainly see that in addiction, let's say. They have their emotions, like they are small personalities, unidimensional, very narrow-minded personalities, but they're personalities, they're not impulses.
So are they personalities within our, what most people would think of as our larger personality? I mean, what I'm hearing is that, let's say somebody's an addict.
It depends on how integrated you are, because you could be nothing but a succession of dominion of sub-personalities. That's what a 2-year-old is, right? And so you have to build an integrating personality on top of those sub-personalities, but not in a manner that inhibits them. That means your socialization is unsophisticated. Even Freud knew this, because even though he had basically an inhibitory model of, say, superego regulation, he believed that a healthy personality would have the impulse of aggression and the impulse of sexuality, to take two major lower order motivational states into account, would have them integrated into the functioning ego. The issue is integration. And so what you're doing when you're socializing, you might think the human organism comes into the world with a warring battleground of primordial motivational states. That's perfectly reasonable view. We know a lot of that is mediated by the hypothalamus, for example, and the amygdala, and these lower order, biologically, pre-programmed, to some degree, pre-programmed systems. Now, the specific manner in which those systems should find their expression and the specific way that they're going to be hierarchically integrated is going to depend to a tremendous degree on the particulars of the society at that moment, which is why you need that 18-year framework to hone the manner in which those systems make themselves manifest. But I think the best way to conceptualize that is that it's the hierarchical integration of the motivational states within an overarching superordinate personality. And that personality is not bound to the moment. It takes the medium and long term into account. And it's not self-serving like a 2-year-old would be, because you have to take other people into account if you're going to be successful. So and this is where the cortex comes in as far as I'm concerned. This is what it's doing. It's it's integrating the lower order, temporally bound motivational states that are specifically self-serving to a much broader vision of the world that takes the future into account and other people. And that's hard. It's very hard.
I love this, and I'll tell you why. Because the way that I think of the prefrontal cortex is that its main job is context-dependent strategy setting.
Right. Context dependent.
Context dependent.
Right. That's a crucial issue.
Right. And you mentioned hypothalamus, this, it's basically the size of, 2 marbles or so sitting above the roof of our mouth. Tiny, tiny little brain area. It's mostly switches in there. What do I mean by that? Anytime a neurosurgeon has stimulated neurons in a little sub-area of the hypothalamus, you get either rage or sexual appetite or mating with inanimate objects. I mean, this was done in both non-human primates and in humans. Uncontrollable thirst, hunger, total suppression of hunger. I mean, all the basic drives are operating in there like switches. And prefrontal cortex has direct access to it, to the hypothalamus. And prefrontal cortex is context-dependent learning, context-dependent decision-making. And I love that you brought in this notion of changing an impulse, in the example that you gave in your son's impulse to be aggressive or wild in some way that was inappropriate for the home environment at that moment. And 2 things that you said really resonate. The prefrontal cortex, his prefrontal cortex, had to learn that whatever he was feeling for himself, his own desires, needed to be placed in a context of other people's wishes, desires, and needs as well. So there's
even for him to thrive, right?
Right.
It's not merely a sacrifice of his own desire for the sake of others. It's like, no, look, kid, we know this. If you have the same orientation towards other people at 4 that you did when you were 2, especially if you're tilted a little in the aggressive direction, you will not make friends and you will be isolated and alienated for the rest of your life. So that 2-year-old impulsiveness, that has its place. 2, it starts to modify radically at 3, and it better be fixed by 4. And the reason for that is that you have to integrate yourself into the social world, which means, in the case of children, it means you want to have friends. And so the reason you're disciplining your child isn't to teach them that what they're doing is bad, in that simple sense that you might interpret punishment. It's like, no, you need to be more sophisticated. Well, why? Well, you have to be able to take turns. Well, why? Well, because no one like you otherwise. Well, what's the problem with that? Well, first of all, we're hypersocial. Like, you can punish psychopaths by putting them in isolation. That's how social human beings are. You can take the most antisocial human beings there are, and you can punish them by making them be alone. Right, so that's how social we are. So you're modeling for your child a strategy of even satisfaction for his own basic drives that takes context in the most sophisticated possible way into account, right? And that is, see, as soon as you understand that that's the fostering of like a meta personality in the child, which would really be the personality of that child, the integrated personality, you start to understand how that might be related to religious thinking, because religious thinking is the attempt to formulate something approximating an ideal personality. Right now, that's often attributed elements of the divine, but there's reasons for that we could go into. But as soon as you know that the basic structure, even at the lower motivational level, is personality, well, then that changes the way you view the brain. Look, a lot of archaic deities are motivational systems.
Right. Could you give me an example?
Well, the god of war, that's rage. That was a god that the Vikings invoked before they went into battle.
A former guest on this podcast, actually, David Anderson at Caltech, has been studying hypothalamic circuits. And he and his former postdoc, Dayu Lin, discovered a small, tiny collection of neurons in the ventromedial hypothalamus that, when stimulated, would send these animals, these mice, you can find videos of this online, into a rage. Mm-hmm. Now, the interesting thing is it required the presence of another mouse.
Right.
And
So it's still somewhat context dependent.
Somewhat context dependent. If they were alone in their cage, they wouldn't attack themselves or the walls of the cage. But if you put a air or water-filled glove within the cage, they would absolutely attack it to try and destroy it. Then you turn off these neurons, the mouse is calm. We can put a link to this in the show note caption. Now, here's what's remarkable. The ventromedial hypothalamus has these neurons basically interspersed with other neurons that, when stimulated, suppress rage and activate copulation. Incredible, right? Within the same structure, you have these mutually exclusive sets of neurons and behaviors.
Yep.
And it speaks to, I think, some of the things that Freud and others have talked about in terms of the juxtaposition of these neurons, but that they mutually inhibit one another, which lends itself to some really interesting questions about when aggression and sexuality become combined in states of pathology. Okay, so but in any event, context-dependent control over impulses, over the hypothalamus, seems to be the theme here. And the other thing that you mentioned is the ability for your son in this case, but presumably also the Vikings, to be able to broaden their temporal scope, to be able to think about the time domain differently. This is something I'm absolutely obsessed by. The more we experience, what I brought up at the beginning was that we have this autonomic arousal system. The more alert we are, the less we are able to take ourselves into notions of this too shall pass. The past, the present, and the future. It tends, autonomic activation, stress, panic, fear, anger tend to make us lose sight. We get blinders on, lose sight of the fact that there was a past, there's a present, and there's a future.
Yes, well, that's because they're collapsing your domain of apprehension to the moment, so you will act. You have to collapse to the moment to act, right? And so we should also point out for everyone that you don't want to underestimate the sophistication of the hypothalamus, and this is partly why conceptualizing its various states as subpersonalities is so useful. I mean, it's not unsophisticated. You can take a female cat and take out its whole brain except for the hypothalamus. So it's like 95% of its brain is gone, and in a relatively controlled environment, it's indistinguishable from a normal cat. It can do cat things and live. Now it's hyper exploratory. Now that's a very strange thing, whereas a cat with no brain is hyper exploratory. It's not what you'd think at all, but it shows you how sophisticated the hypothalamus is. It can run these programs, but they're programs of personality because they have perceptions. It can run them, and it can do that quite successfully. Now, all the higher order subcortical and cortical systems are, well, I think they are, to your point, they're ways of expanding the apprehension of those fundamental motivational systems across broader and broader spans of time, incorporating more and more people, but also solving the problem of the conflict that emerges between those fundamental motivational states, right? It's like, well, what do you do when you're hungry and tired, right? Well, you have to mediate between the states to some degree. What do you do if you want to solve the problem of being hungry and tired over a long period of time with other people? Right, well, you need more and more brain to calculate that, right? And so a huge part of what maturation is when we think about it as the capacity to forego gratification. Actually, what's happening is that as you mature and your cortex comes online, let's say, you're able to regulate your behavior with more and more other things taken into account. Right. And you know, that there has to be some war there, which is why you're wrestling with God, let's say. There has to be some war there because it's also the case that you do have to satiate yourself in relationship to your basic biological needs or you die. And so there's going to be tension. And that is something like the tension between the individual and the group, you might say. That's how the Rousseauians or the Freudians would think about it. So the weird thing about that is that it's not useful to identify your individuality with the dominion of a whim. And that's what hedonists do, and that's what immature people do. They think, well, why shouldn't I get what I want? It's like, I see. So your claim is that the you that's superordinate is what you want. That isn't. That means you're subjugated to these low-order personalities. Mm-hmm. And you might say, well, why is that wrong? It's like, well, you're a 2-year-old. It doesn't work. You know, if it's all about you and your immediate gratification, well, first of all, you're rather psychopathic, because you could think of psychopathy as the extension of immaturity into adulthood. That's a pretty good default way of conceptualizing it. It's like, it's an unsophisticated strategy.
They want what they want now.
Regardless.
And they don't care about the we.
Or the future.
Or the future.
See, this is one of the ways I cottoned on to this relationship was, because I studied antisocial behavior for a very long time. Psychopaths in particular are notorious for their inability to learn from experience. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that if they do something impulsive that causes them trouble in the future, the fact of that future trouble has no bearing on their continued behavior. Well, what that means is that they are so non-communitarian that they're willing to even betray their own future selves. There's no difference between that and betraying someone else. It's exactly the same mechanism.
Very much a toddler.
Well, so here's something I learned in Montreal. I worked with a man named Richard Tremblay there, and I think Richard's lab used up 1/3 of all social science funding for Quebec at one time. He was a radically successful researcher, and he was really interested in antisocial behavior and was trying to get to the roots. And one of the conclusions that our lab enterprise moved towards was that, one observation was that if you take 2-year-olds, if you take kids at different ages, you could imagine you made a group of 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, group of 4-year-olds, all the way up to 15. You just let them interact. The 2-year-olds are the most aggressive. But if you analyze the 2-year-olds themselves, you find that all the aggressive kids are boys, and it's only a fraction of them, about 5%. So if you group 2-year-olds together, 5% of the boys will kick, steal, hit, and bite, which was our definition of early onset antisocial behavior. Almost all of those kids are socialized by the age of 4, right? The remnant that aren't get alienated because they have no friends, and they're the ones who become juvenile delinquents, and then early onset criminals, and then repeat offenders. Right, and so what it is imagine there's some kids whose default, their rage circuits are a little bit more dominant than the typical kid. Eh? They're often bigger physically.
Yeah, especially the biting. Forgive me for interrupting, but there's a very interesting paper published about 2 years ago showing that there's a specific circuit from the hypothalamus to the neurons that control jaw closure that are independent of the neurons that control jaw closure for eating and for drinking.
Oh, yeah.
That are specifically for aggressive biting. Mm-hmm. I mean, I hope people understand the significance of this, because what this means is there are dedicated circuits for aggressive biting in your hypothalamus. We all learn to suppress these, except probably under conditions where our life is endangered, in which case you'd probably bite like hell in order to try and get out of that circumstance. But we are all born with this circuit. We die with this circuit. Most of us, apparently not these kids, learn to suppress this circuit.
Right. Or integrate.
An 8-year-old biter is a scary thing.
Right.
A 1-year-old biter is like a little bit of a worrisome thing. A 2-year-old, like, okay, we need to work on this.
Yeah.
An 8-year-old biter, people are starting to be concerned. I think even without knowledge of the psychopathology literature, one would be very concerned if their 8-year-old is biting other kids.
Right.
Not just because of the damage induced, but it's so very different and
so
much more primitive than
Yeah.
even hitting or spitting or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's the indication of a virtual absence of sophisticated socialization.
They are truly in their hypothalamus.
Yeah, right, exactly. And that's, well, especially if you have a hypothalamus that's tilted towards rage, let's say, and defensive or predatory aggression, that's bad news. Now, so what's the upshot of that? Well, the upshot is that there's a subset of kids whose default reactions aren't socialized, and we associate that with psychopathy and long-term criminality. This is a really useful thing to understand, that much of what we see as pathology, and I would say the same thing about narcissism and certain forms of hedonism, essentially what it is failure of socialization, right? And this has very interesting political implications, because it also implies that, imagine that impulsive self-gratification is a personality. The desire for impulsive self-gratification is a personality with its own political opinions. Nietzsche said in the late 1800s that every drive attempts to philosophize in its spirit. Brilliant, a brilliant observation. Mm-hmm. Far different than conceiving of the, say, hypothalamic drives as deterministic chains of only impulses. And another thing to consider, too, with regards to the effect of hypothalamic motivation on perception, that mouse that you talked about whose attack system is activated electronically. See, when that glove is dropped, you can see that there's a relationship with perception. Because if there's no target for attack that's biologically relevant in the environment, there's no impulse. So you could imagine that what happens is when you activate those neurons is that there's a set of perceptual stimuli that are much more likely to be classified as a defeatable enemy. Mm-hmm. Now, even a glove will do it. Mm-hmm. Right. So you drop in a glove, and that's now perceived as defeatable enemy, or perhaps threat, because we don't know exactly what the perception would be. But then you see, then it's the perception driving the behavior. That's not an impulse. Right. That's more like a strategy. And I really started to understand some of the literature on the evolution of religious thinking when I started to understand motivational states as personalities. Because one of the things that you see, this is so cool, something I tried to talk to Dawkins about, the greatest historian of religions who ever lived was Mircea Eliade, and he wrote a sequence of brilliant books. The Sacred and the Profane is the best one to start with. Very short book, very elegant book. And what Eliade documented across the world was the pattern by which polytheistic belief systems turned into monotheistic belief systems. That parallels maturation. It's the same thing. And so the polytheistic gods tend to be representations of motivational states.
I'm going to pause you there because I think this is extremely important. So the god of war.
Or the god of love.
The goddess of love.
Exactly that.
So the idea that the different gods are the reflective of different, we'll just say it as neuroscientists, as different hypothalamic and related circuits.
Why wouldn't they be gods? You know, beware of falling under their dominion. Beware of becoming their playthings. And the other thing that's very interesting, you see, is that you have to also understand that these don't exist independently of historical context. So let's say rage. It's like there's a literature of rage. There's a culture of rage. There are patterns of rage that are played out in drama and literature. Like, it's not only that the motivational impulse is a personality, it's a personality with a history and a philosophy. And if you don't think it can possess you, you don't know very much about possession. So, like, for example, if you're fighting with someone and you become enraged, as you said, your temporal purview shrinks, and your notion of what constitutes victory is radically transfigured. So if you're fighting with someone you love, you might want to defeat them or even hurt them, independently of the fact that you actually love them. Well, then you think, well, you're gripped by these impulses. No, you're inhabited by the spirit of rage. And if you're a sophisticated person, there's going to be an endless stream of sophisticated intellectual rationalizations that come along with that possession. Right? It's full-fledged personality, and it's one of the things you see with people who are psychotic, who drift off into the landscape of their imagination, is that they dwell on such states of possession. So, for example, these kids that shoot up high schools, like they're fantasizing under the influence of rage and resentment for thousands of hours. That just takes control of them. And it's not a simple impulse. It's like, no, they've inverted you could think they've inverted the neurological order, and the god of rage is now the what would you say, the leading personality of integration, or the god of resentful rage, even worse.
And the circuit may run in reverse. My colleague David Spiegel, who's our vice chair of psychiatry at Stanford, has done some beautiful experiments examining the relationship between prefrontal cortical areas and the insula, a brain area that has a map of our internal body state, interoception, our ability to sense our internal workings, et cetera. In any event, there are certain conditions, including depression, where the direction of flow between the prefrontal cortex and the insula literally reverses. It's like running against the typical traffic. This is a very different example because here you're presenting in the context of rage and sociopathy and these kids who shoot up schools. But I do absolutely subscribe to what you just said, that if one drops into one of these more primitive states and emotions and all the things that go with it for a very long time, it's almost as if the governor, which is the prefrontal cortex, starts to become the governed. That the whole circuit starts to run from bottom up as opposed to top down.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think there's good neurological
That's
evidence.
what happens in addiction.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And
again,
so you hit that circuit that's seeking the drug with repeated doses of dopamine. People say they have a monkey on their back. It's like, no, they have a monster in their brain, and they grew it, and it grows because it's reinforced with dopaminergic hits. And as it grows, its capacity to dominate increases. And so when there's a cue for the addiction, this is why people relapse when they get out of a treatment center. They'll go back to their normal environment after having dealt with the physiological withdrawal, let's say, and a cued craving will make itself manifest, like a friend they freebase with, and it's all of a sudden, whoa, that monster is alive, and it just shuts everything else down. And it's got a personality. It can lie. One of the hallmarks of addictive behavior is lying. And the lies are the rationalizations of that subcircuit, subpersonality, for its own pathological behavior. And that's all reinforced too by the dopaminergic hits.
It's like there's multiple people in there. In everyone. One of the most incredible
polytheistic paganism.
Polytheistic.
Yeah, that's the default condition. Mm-hmm. Right. That's the condition of the 2-year-old. One of the things you want to do when you treat addiction is you want to substitute a new incentive structure, right? Because the part of the addictive process is you fall into a false incentive pattern, right? Because cocaine makes you feel like you're doing something useful in respect to an important goal, even though you're not. It mimics that.
Even if you know you're not. It's a remarkable drug in the sense that people who take cocaine seem to be excited about everything. They're in this high dopaminergic state. And their brain becomes exceptionally good at finding cocaine even in the absence of resources, which is pretty remarkable if you think about it. Most people can't find the thing or get the thing they want in the absence of the resources to get it. But people who take hard drugs that really spike dopamine somehow manage. Yeah, sure. Sometimes they
find
lie,
a path.
sometimes lie, cheat, and steal.
Lie,
cheat, and steal, but they'll do other things too, right? Yeah. They'll socialize with people that have it so they don't have to lie, cheat, and steal. Yeah. It's incredible to see that drug and things like methamphetamine take over people's minds. And now I'm thinking...
The pathway appears when the aim is firmly in mind. Right. See, this is another insistence that's derived from the religious literature. So, because the idea there is that if your aim is upward, the pathway forward to that will make itself manifest. And that's true. You just pointed out that it was true in relationship to addiction. Right. Is that if once you're in that realm of possessed personality, the pathway forward will show itself to you even under straitened circumstances. Right, and it's partly because you could think of our perceptual systems and our emotional systems, for that matter, as navigating tools. Right, so now the addicted brain, what they say, the aim is possessed by the substance of addiction. Right, so now the highest god is cocaine, let's say. And so now all pathways in the world are pathways to cocaine. All objects in the world are markers on the pathway to cocaine because it just dominates, but it's not just an impulse. It dominates the perceptual landscape as well. That makes it, and the emotional landscape. And it comes with all these rationalizations. That's all those lies, right? The whole thing, it's a whole personality. Yeah, brutal.
Nowadays, I get a lot of questions about pornography. And the discussion around pornography is always related to the discussion around masturbation. But let's just talk about pornography for a moment in this context of these primitive drives and these circuits within the hypothalamus, which we were all born with, that Clearly, some of them are devoted to our progression as a species through reproduction. Zero question about that. Sexual behavior being linked to reproduction. Not always, but certainly. We can all agree on that.
It's a necessary precondition.
I hope we can still all agree on that. But last time I checked, that's still true. A sperm and an egg met someplace in some context to create all of us. Okay? We're still grounded in that. Pornography is something that I hear quite a lot from typically young males, but sometimes young females or even older females who say that they can see themselves trying to resist the desire to go look at it. And it almost doesn't feel like a desire anymore. They're sort of just in a kind of a compulsion that is almost unconscious, but they're just aware of the fact that they're
like an eating disorder.
Like an eating disorder. They're doing it. They know they shouldn't be doing it, and they can't help themselves. And we could think about two ways to attack this if one believes it's a real concern, and they certainly do. So I do. I would be open if I had or do. Pornography has not been my thing, and I don't struggle with it. But when I hear from these people, it's so clear that they're asking, is it the prevalence of pornography out there? Or is it something really broken in them? Like, are they broken? But I don't know that I would say, after having the discussion we've had thus far, that they're broken. It seems to me that it's like as you said, it's the manifestation of one part of their, it's one personality within them.
Well, and it's been compulsively rewarded. So, when you see yourself moving towards the culmination of a desired goal, a dopamine, that's accompanied by dopamine release, okay? And so two things, this, but everybody who's listening might not. There's two elements to that dopamine release. One is pleasure, but the other is that the dopamine, imagine that there are circuits activated as you're acting. What the dopamine does is increase the probability that the circuits that were activated just before the positive experience happened grow. Okay, so now if you're engaged with pornography and that culminates in successful sexual satiation, which it can, that's what masturbation does, then the whole personality that's oriented toward that set of stimuli is going to come to dominate. It's very much like an addiction, except there's been work done with generally simpler animals on these phenomena called super stimuli. I think it's stickleback fish where this was first observed. So males, I hope I get this right, but I've got it approximately right. I believe it's male sticklebacks they're very aggressive towards other male sticklebacks. And the reason they're aggressive is because the other male sticklebacks have a red dot on their bellies. So they don't like red dots at all. And so you can really enrage a stickleback with a red dot. And if you use a red dot that's a little bigger and a little brighter than the typical red dot, you get a super stimulus. It's virtually irresistible to the stickleback. And it's weird because the maximal activation is produced by a stimulus that they wouldn't see in nature. It slightly exceeds, that's exactly what pornography does. It's a super stimulus, right? And it's not surprising that young males in particular are susceptible to that because male sexuality in human beings is very visually oriented. Very. And a lot of our brain is visual, way more than virtually every other animal, certainly every other primate and every other mammal. And so we have a situation where any 13-year-old boy can see more hyper-attractive, super stimulus women in one day than the most successful man who ever lived 100 years ago would have ever seen in his whole life. Yeah, well, that's like an evolutionary, radical ecological transformation. And it's worse because it's easily accessible, so it takes no work, right? So not only is it a super stimulus, it's one that's at hand, so to speak.
And the analog in the food world would be sugar. Highly palatable, highly processed food.
Yeah, sugar-fat combination.
You go into the other day I went into a gas station to use the restroom because I was traveling home for Thanksgiving, and I looked around and I thought, this isn't a convenience store. This is a pharmacy.
Right.
Everything that had chocolate also seemed to have caffeine and color. Every drink seemed to combine not just sugar, but also caffeine and some other things that would provide stimulants. Then you've got nicotine.
Energy drinks.
And these things on their own aren't necessarily bad, any one of these one elements in low enough doses, in frequent use, et cetera. But maybe sugar being the one that clearly I think deserves deeper investigation, right? But it just
Well,
occurred to me
there
that
isn't much different than difference between manufacturing sugar and manufacturing cocaine. I mean, you take something that's available in its natural form in relatively low concentrations and purify it. I mean, coca leaves, the natives used coca leaves forever as mild stimulant, didn't seem to cause them any trouble, but that's way different than cocaine, right? And sugar has the same, arguably, the same pathological properties.
Well, I didn't think we were going to go here, but I think it's extremely appropriate and important that we do. So I know that you followed what is essentially an elimination diet for a number of years. You eat meat, right? I eat meat, vegetables, fruit, and some starches, unrefined starches. In any event, one thing that I think is absolutely clear from following a clean diet, so to speak, of any kind, but let's say of the sort that you follow or I follow, is that you very soon learn the relationship between taste of the food, volume of the food, macronutrient, so protein, fat, or carbohydrate content, micronutrients, and satiation. Which is, if you think about it, it's sort of like a big plate of broccoli or a big steak or something. The brain learns and the hypothalamus learns the association between the taste, the caloric content, what else is in there, and satiation. If you think about highly processed food or even combinations of multiple ingredients, that's absolutely impossible to do. The brain can't parse what are the various things in here and how do they relate to my feelings of satisfaction. It's the difference between a super drug and what I believe are the elements that were
Explain why you think that link about satiation can't be learned in the case of these processed foods.
Yeah, because in the context of these processed foods, they're activating multiple neuron systems in the hypothalamus and gut. We know that the gut has neurons that can respond to sugar, fatty acids, and amino acid content. And there's this prominent theory that one of the main reasons we eat is to forage for amino acids, that we'll eat until we get enough of the essential amino acids. And we correlate that with taste, but that the gut has neurons, where we know the gut has neurons that signal through the vagus up through a little relay called the nodose ganglion, if you want to look at it, fun name, and then up to the dopaminergic centers of the brain, which make us, when we eat something that has a high essential amino acid content, like a steak, like a really tasty steak, the neurons in the gut, in a way that is independent of taste, are signaling to the brain, I'm getting essential amino acids. You should eat more of this thing. If those, let's just say a small fraction of those amino acids that are present in a candy bar or in a package of Skittles, which I'm guessing there's very few of them, if any, you're going to continue to forage for food because those neurons will also respond to sugar. Basically, it will keep you eating until you get enough of those amino acids. In other words, there are two parallel tracks, one within our taste system.
Multiple pathways to satiation.
Right, they're totally right. Multiple pathways to satiation, one dependent on taste, one dependent on actual nutrient content. The mouth can only learn taste association. The mouth can't actually learn nutrient content. The gut knows nutrient content. The problem is you take a food that is low in a micronutrient or macronutrient or essential amino acids or essential fatty acids. After all, there are no essential carbohydrates. There are only essential amino acids and essential fatty acids.
Right.
And it will keep you eating, and it will keep the appetite system revving until you get enough of those. Now, here's the issue. If you've ever done this, it's probably been
empty calories.
Empty calories.
Yeah.
But so in some ways, this again is an analog to the whole discussion around pornography, masturbation, and reproduction, right? I'm not saying that reproduction is the be-all, end-all of sexual activity, but in the evolutionary sense, it absolutely is, right? There's no question about that. There's no moral judgment there. That's just the reality. So the situation with food is the following. If we are eating without any gut level understanding of what's coming in, we will keep eating. If you, let me give an example. You probably haven't done this experiment in a while, but if you've ever just had, ribeye steak or two, it's pretty satiating. Maybe you also have a salad if you're me, or some broccoli or something like that. If one takes, then even after you've eaten all that, one bite of pasta, the next impulse is more.
Yes.
Right? Even though you already have enough essential amino acids from those steaks, your leucine, threshold, you've reached that, et cetera, all of that good stuff. Why? Because blood glucose goes up and then you desire more because blood glucose elevations are linked directly to the dopaminergic system. So what I'm basically trying to say here is that I do think that there are elements to our food, modern food, if you will. It seems like it's, anything but modern in the sense that it's worse for us than the more primitive foods, but highly processed foods, pornography, any drug that spikes dopamine dramatically, like methamphetamine, for instance, any behavior that spikes dopamine dramatically, that very quickly hijacks these circuits. And to me, the way to teach those circuits a calmer, more prudent version of themselves, right, to enter a different hypothalamic activation pattern, is to start breaking the things down into their essential elements, right, about the motivation, the pleasure, et cetera, to tamp all that down. I mean, we know that for pornography, if the pornography is very extreme, then less extreme pornography doesn't seem to work.
Well, that's because there's also a novelty kick in dopaminergic striving, right? I mean, so with any basic appetitive pleasure, there's a dopaminergic kick. But with any novelty, there's also a dopaminergic kick. So there's an optimized threshold for novelty and appetitive striving that plays out in pornography. So there's the direct effect of the stimulus as such, but there's variation in the stimulus that's also novel. And so it's a common pattern for pornographic usage to become more, what would you say, fetishistic. That's one way of thinking about it as it progresses, because that keeps the novelty alive. Right. That's very dangerous. That's a very dangerous development.
Right, and I would venture in a very different domain that if you were to eat your steaks slathered in barbecue sauce for a couple of weeks, going back to the way that you eat them now, which, by the way, this is a great opportunity to educate people about something that you taught me when we had dinner last, which is that if you're going to order a steak, order a Pittsburgh char. The char on the outside is incredibly tasty. We love that, the umami taste. Is that we should have a devoted taste receptor to that?
That's complex.
Yeah. So, and if they don't know what a Pittsburgh char is, then maybe you're in the wrong restaurant or you need to educate them. But incredibly satiating, delicious, right? But if you were to slather those steaks in a bunch of things, I would suspect that after a while, your plain steaks wouldn't taste as good.
Oh, certainly.
But the way to make them taste good again would be to eat them plain for a period of time in which the stuff, all the condiments, et cetera, would start to become aversive. I do believe that when we return to the sort of most naturally satisfying mode of engaging with these circuits, here we're talking about food and sex in parallel, that they become especially satiating.
The word sin in many languages means to miss the target. Right. And it speaks to exactly what you're describing, like that the cachet of action at a distance, that's unbelievably deeply embedded in us. That's why I made that throwing gesture. Like human beings throw. That's our physiology, right? We can throw something at a distant target. Well, that's structured our cognition. We're using our thoughts to hit distant targets. That's what we do. All the games that young men play, so many of those games are target games. All of the sports spectacles that people want to participate in even vicariously, they're target-hitting games. Like our gaze specifies as the center of a target. There's targets everywhere, and we're unbelievably focused on bridging the gap between where we are and where we're going. Yeah, that's the whole perceptual landscape. If you hearken to the voice that calls you out of your zone of comfort, and you do that voluntarily, so you put yourself on the edge of adventure, you will be following the instinct that has already evolved to make your life a blessing to yourself, to make you successful among other people, to maximize your probability of long-term success, and to do that in a way that brings abundance to your community. And then you think, look, let's take the contrary hypothesis. The contrary hypothesis would be twofold. There is no compulsion to adventure. It's like, that seems highly improbable. Or that the compulsion to adventure isn't aligned with psychological and social well-being. Well, what's the chance that the fundamental drive that would facilitate your transformation across time would not be aligned with your psychological integrity and the success of the community? Like, we wouldn't be social animals if that was the case. So as far as I can tell, that has to be true. Now, that doesn't mean you can get lost in false adventures. That can happen. That's what an addiction is, or that's what pornography is. It's a false adventure, right? It's failure to hit the proper target, you might say. But that central drive to integration across time and communally, why wouldn't that be an instinct? And then we could cap that with an observation that I also think is self-evidently true once you understand it. So imagine that you're a father. Now, this spirit of adventure is often characterized paternally, right? Insofar as God's the father in these ancient stories. So think about this. So when you see your son, now it's also true of your daughter, but I'll focus on sons for the moment. When you see your son, and you love your son, when you see your son pushing himself beyond his own limits in an adventurous manner, if you're a good father, you definitely encourage that, right? And I would say, insofar as you encourage that, you are a good father. If you're possessed by rage, different phenomena have dopaminergic cachet to you than if you're possessed by sexual desire. Like obviously, right?
Absolutely.
Right. So the idea that a given stimuli produces a given motivational response is incorrect because that's framework dependent, right? So I think one of the best ways to understand a motivational drive is that a motivational drive grips the target. It establishes the target, right? And it may increase the probability that certain action patterns will make themselves manifest. That would be the kind of the compulsive element. But fundamentally what it's doing is changing the target. That rearranges the perceptual landscape and it transforms the emotions. Because now, if your target is there, things that lead you there are dopaminergically relevant. Right. If your target is there, things that lead you there are relevant. Same underlying emotion, but the stimuli, so to speak, that give rise to the emotion are radically different. So now he has a different orientation and aim. And so the incentive structure of his psyche is radically transformed. Now, we know that can happen because that happens to you when you move from one motivated state to another.
And I think in 12-step programs, they allow the steps to be milestones. I mean, there's clearly a dopaminergic component. I hope people understand that dopamine is dumb. In fact, dopamine isn't dumb. Dopamine has no intelligence at all. It's just a currency of motivation and reward. And
which is why it can be gamed by cocaine.
Which is why it can be gamed by cocaine or most anything that can, ferret its way into the hypothalamic system. And I hope people picked up on what you said before because it's so important that as one moves toward a target, dopamine increases en route to that target. I'm rephrasing what you said before. You said it wonderfully. I just want to make sure people understand that as that dopamine increases, the probability that your perception will go to something other than the target decreases exponentially. As you get closer and closer, you get more and more dopamine. The greater the elevation in dopamine, the lower the probability that you'll engage in any other pattern of self.
Right.
It's almost or personality type other than the one that you're engaged in pursuit of this behavior will emerge.
Right. Not least because as you approach successfully, the probability of ultimate success is obviously increasing. Right. So it makes perfect sense that you would narrow and focus.
Right. You run faster as you see the finish line.
Right.
Faster and faster.
Right.
This concept of sin as missing the target, or this definition of sin, I think is incredibly important.
Hamartia is the Greek word, and it's literally an archery term, but it's also the word for sin in ancient Hebrew is also an archery term. And there's other languages where that's the case, but it's really important to understand that notion is predicated on this target-seeking psychophysiology, and that's unbelievably deeply built into us, as you pointed out. So what that implies, in keeping with our previous conversation, is that as you mature and your cortex integrates and you become cortically dominant, the targets of your gaze become voluntary. Right. This is a big deal because it means that you can concentrate on the distal, let's say, the temporally distal, at the expense of the proximal. And Friston surprised me because he said he has a theory of positive emotion that's analogous. He also knew the negative emotion. He'd also been working in that domain. He said that you get a dopamine kick when you reduce the entropy in relationship to a goal. And I thought, oh my God, that's so cool because it means that uncertainty is entropy. When it emerges, you get anxious. But when you see yourself stepping towards a goal, you get a dopamine kick. And the reason that's an entropy related to entropy is because with each successful step you take towards a goal, you reduce the uncertainty of the pursuit, which is manifested in that phenomena you described, which is when you see the finish line, you start running faster. Right, so they're both related to entropy. There's two corollaries of that. One is that the more valuable the goal towards which you're progressing, the higher the dopamine kick per unit of advancement. So what that means is you want an ultimate goal operating in the domain of each proximal sub-goal. And that's what happens with this upward orientation. It's like what you're trying to do is to make things as good as they could be, whatever that means, over the longest possible span of time for the largest number of people, you included. Now, you're not going to know exactly how to do that, but that can be your goal. Okay, now that's going to inform your perceptions and your perceptions of pathway, but it's also going to modify your reward system, because now every proximal step forward is an indicator of entropy reduction in regard to that meta goal. Well, there isn't any, by definition, there isn't anything you can do that's more exciting than that. See, that kind of explains why your friend was able to pop out of his addictive frame, because now he's doing something that's so worthwhile that the temptation of alcohol, let's say, pales in comparison. Right. And
right. It's a rewriting of the reward contingencies.
Yeah, right, exactly. And now you could imagine a situation where a culture explores across time to find out how to characterize that goal such that if that goal is pursued, people integrate psychologically in a manner that integrates them socially across large spans of time. I think that's what happens when the monotheistic revelation emerges. That's what's happening from a biological perspective, is that we're starting to characterize the longest term goal. Yeah, something like that.
This is why I believe that pornography is potentially so poisonous, because the level of uncertainty is basically zero.
Yeah.
People can access what they want to see. They can keep foraging until they find it.
Yeah.
And that's not the way that relationships work. The way relationships work is I ask somebody out, they might say yes, they might say no. Yeah. You go out on a date, they might not want a second date.
Yeah. Well, and that's all
things could progress. You might think that you're on the path to one thing, and it turns out it doesn't work, or you're not compatible.
That's also extremely salutary, because if you're being rejected, like say you're a foraging male and you're being rejected all the time, and you forego that for pornography, what you're foregoing is the corrective that all those women are offering you. Like, they're rejecting you because there is something wrong. Like, seriously, there's something wrong. And now you escape from that. You think, well, that's a relief because no more rejection. It's like, yeah, no more rejection, no more learning, no more improvement, and no possibility of an actual life, right?
No action at a distance.
Yeah. No distal accomplishment, right?
Yeah. The only implication of the pornography masturbation scenario is more pornography masturbation. That's the only implication of it. That's all that possibly could arise.
It's worse than that.
Yeah.
Because it's more pornography in a degenerating game, because as you said, you have to chase that novelty edge.
Otherwise, dopamine is driven down further.
Well, and that means what? It's going to get more and more extreme? Mm-hmm. Well, that's not a good scenario. That's not a good, like, what do you mean more and more extreme exactly? Like, where does that end? Well, a casual glance at online pornography can give you some real insight into where that ends. Like, that's a bottomless pit, and in the most pernicious possible manner, because sexuality can definitely twist itself into pathological forms that undermine psychological integrity and demolish society. So the postmodernists, they figured out that we see the world through a story. And they were right. And that's a devastating blow to the empiricists and the rationalists, because they were wrong. We do not build our knowledge in consequence of an aggregation of facts. That's not how it works. And a story is something like the prioritization of the world of facts.
I heard recently that religion teaches through story,
yeah.
Philosophy teaches through language that is divorced of story, mm-hmm. and that science is designed to try and remove itself from language almost entirely. I mean, you'd love to just present graphs and figures, but you have to explain what's in those, right? There's a discussion, there's some conclusions, but the idea is that as scientists, we're supposed to be objective and just interpret the data as they stand. But story is the way that the brain works.
Where do you start dealing with chaos? Wherever you can. Put something in order by your own standards of order, and then see what happens. Because what will happen is now you got a little corner of order, and now you're a little more well situated, and then you'll be able to see what's the next step. And you might think, well, it looks hopeless because there's just chaos everywhere. It's like, it's okay because the process is exponential. So even if you start nowhere, if you keep doubling, you're going to get somewhere and faster than you think. And, well, the same thing applies when you're plummeting into the abyss, unfortunately.
The degenerative stuff. A colleague of mine who studies it, he's a geneticist, said, it takes many, many, many generations to evolve a species. It doesn't take very many to devolve a species. Negative mutations can build on another and crash a species very, very fast. I think our psyche is similar in that way.
Well, that's an entropic problem. There's way more ways to make something complex worse than there are to make it better. Right. That's why it's a straight and narrow path. What's the book?
The book is called The Courage to be Disliked. And I highly recommend it to everybody. It was actually written by a Japanese author. I think there are 2 Japanese authors. It didn't get quite so popular in this country, but it had a big following in Japan and I think in other places in Asia. And the book is set up as a conversation between essentially a philosopher of Adlerian psychology and a student who's challenging him. So it's a conversation that raises all the challenges that would come to one's mind if you were to be presented with this idea of life tasks, and that we're supposed to discard with our thoughts about prior trauma and just figure out what are our tasks now.
Right.
And I like the practicality of it. It seems to fit quite well with your notions and what you've talked about in multiple books, including the most recent one, the one that's out now, about getting really serious about what your tasks are at this moment in time and embracing those tasks as a way to progress forward.
Yes.
As opposed to floundering in notions about the past. And I think it might hit some people square upside the head when there's, I think that one of the chapters opens with the words, "There's no such thing as trauma," which is clearly not true. But the whole idea is to prompt a different way of thinking and to let people start to drill into, like, okay, what do I need to do now, regardless of what my parents did or didn't do?
Regardless of my damaged self.
Right, regardless of my damaged self. And I must say I really like the book.
Yes, well, Adler was the most practical of the small crowd that aggregated around Freud. And so Jung's take was that Freud focused on sex and Adler focused on power and Jung focused on what transcended both. And I think that's right. Now, Adler is a good riposte to Freud in exactly the way you described. If you like that book and you're interested in all 3 of them, let's say, there's a great book called Discovery of the Unconscious, which was written by a man named Henri Ellenberger, who was the foremost exponent of existential psychology in the 1950s. Brilliant scholar. And it is the best analysis of Freud, Jung, and Adler that's ever been written by a lot. And it's a truly great book. He also traces the idea of the unconscious back 350 years before Freud. So it's a masterful study. But I liked Adler, and he was much less charismatic than Freud and Jung, and so his star didn't shine as brightly, but he's very practically oriented, and much of his thinking, what would you say, fits quite nicely with the same kind of bottom-up approach that a more behaviorally oriented psychotherapist would employ. And if you're looking for a psychologist to help you figure out how you could advance from where you are now, he's got plenty of things to say that are good. He also wasn't as good a literary stylist as Jung or Freud, so that also put him off to the side to some degree.
There isn't really a satisfactory book about the brain, the mind, and psychology. This just doesn't exist.
Yeah, the closest one I ever encountered probably is Affective Neuroscience, Panksepp's book. Like Panksepp showed, for example, that play wouldn't emerge among animals if they were possessed by any other motivational state.
Thanks for listening to this installment of The Podcram. I hope it contains something useful for you. If you enjoy these selections and are curious about the curator's own thoughts, you can check out my other podcast, Psychic Lube, where I share concise concepts meant to grease the intellectual gears and help get your creative juices flowing. Each episode is an ongoing collaborative project that welcomes listeners to expand or rebut its points by email or comment, the most interesting of which get incorporated through periodic re-recordings. As always, if you're intrigued by today's content, I encourage you to go listen to the full podcast in its original form directly from its creators so that their sponsors keep paying them to make stuff for us and nobody feels compelled to sue me for copyright infringement. Now, get off your phone and go do smart stuff. Have a productive day.